Down affirmative action in higher education, meaning it is now against the law to consider race as a factor for someone's admission.
It's a ruling already seeing criticism from the White House. The ruling today marks a change to more than 40 years of legal precedent and reflects the 6-3 split of conservatives to liberals on the court. In the opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts declared Harvard and the University of North Carolina have violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor says, quote, equal educational opportunity is a prerequisite to achieving racial equality in our nation. The president also responded today.
Discrimination still exists in America. Today's decision does not change that. We cannot let this decision be the last word.
Both UNC and Harvard have issued statements saying they will comply with the court's decision.
Closer to home, today's Supreme Court ruling could impact the University of Wisconsin system, especially at its Madison campus,
which is more selective in its admission criteria. In a First Alert update, Jason Zimmerman has reaction from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle.
The ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court banning affirmative action comes the same week as Republican lawmakers in Wisconsin introduce a bill requiring the UW system to accept any high school student finishing in the top 5% of their class. Representative Dave Murphy is among the authors.
The Supreme Court here is trying to make sure that that the universities are treating students fairly.
Murphy says he anticipated this ruling and hopes it will benefit the passage of his bill, even though similar legislation was vetoed by the governor last year.
In this particular case, it was Asian students that were really being discriminated against, students that had worked hard, had talent, and had shown the merit of what they were able to do, and they were being excluded.
However, Democrats disagree and point to the 9 states which have already banned affirmative action as having a negative impact on the number of minority applicants.
We've already seen like a 50% drop in minority participation in higher education from the states where affirmative action has already collapsed.
Congresswoman Gwen Morris says the ruling is a major setback to diversity efforts among the college population.
I hope that the universities put a lot of effort into figuring this out.
I also reached out to the UW system, and a spokesperson tells me they are still reviewing this ruling and whether it will have any impact on their admissions criteria moving forward. Reporting in Grand Chute, Jason Zimmerman, Action 2 News.